Hello, OwOmaCon or OwOmaCon. OwOmaCon sounds better to me, I think. Thank you for letting me give this talk today. I apologize I can't be there in person. Normally I would love to be there and give a talk like this to a room full of furries. It's never quite the same thing when it comes to these pandemics, is it? Nevertheless, as a professor, I'm getting accustomed to teaching my students online, and certainly the rest of the world has learned to just slowly get used to this new reality of ours. So in that spirit, I will present to you a version of the talk that I typically give at a convention like this. It is pre-recorded like this. Again, not ideal, but ultimately we do our best. So after this pre-recorded talk, there'll be an opportunity, I'm being told, for FAQ, or not FAQs, for Q&A at the end. So we'll have a chance to hear some of your questions and answer some of them. So if, as you're listening to this talk, if you want to jot down a question or two that comes to mind, I'd be happy to take a crack at trying to answer it. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to what a bunch of nerds have to say about the furry fandom, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Okay, so let's jump into the talk. 50 Crazy Facts About Furries. Number 28 will totally blow your mind, and this is definitely not clickbait, and it's definitely funded by the Canadian government, specifically the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So thank you very much for that. Let's jump into fun fact number 1, and a special thanks to all of the models who helped us to make these 50 fun facts more visually interesting to look at. So fun fact number 1. We are real scientists who study furries. So the fine folks at Furscience, myself and all of my collaborators here, Dr. Elizabeth Fine, Dr. Kathleen Gerbasi, Dr. Stephen Rayson, Dr. Sharon Roberts, and myself, Dr. Courtney Nuka-Plante, we are all scientists who study furries. We are social scientists who, for the last 10 years, have looked at more than, at this point, 30,000 furries worldwide. And we publish this stuff in scientific journals. We make it all available on our website. And we've even published a book, which sort of takes all of this data and puts it all in one place. So we are legitimate scientists doing legitimate science, and we are not the only ones. So a huge shout out to Mikhail Dmitrovich Danilov, who's been helping us collect data on Eastern European furries. And thank you to Gao, who has been helping us to collect data on Southeast Asian furries. Some of their data will pop up throughout this talk. So fun fact number 2, jumping into it, furries are fans. So when we study furries, we are doing so from the perspective of fan researchers. We study furries as fans, specifically people who are fans of media that feature anthropomorphized animal characters. So that's our definition of what a furry is. There are other definitions that others will use. That's just the one we use for our research, which means, if you use this definition, that a furry is a person who likes this stuff enough that they define themselves by it. Right? So you are defined in part by your interest in this topic. So it's an identity, not just an interest. It's not just, oh, you're a person who happens to like this show. No, you like it enough that you slap the label of fan on yourself. This also means that you decide whether or not you're a furry. Someone else can't really decide that for you. So fun fact number 3, furry media, when we talk about furry content, there's a lot more to it than just watching Disney movies, which is what a lot of people think we're talking about. As you delve into it, it turns out that furry media is pretty diverse, and what constitutes as furry media ranges depending on who you talk to, what context or medium you're talking about, which is not to say that there isn't Disney stuff in the furry fandom. To be sure, Disney is one of the top 10 biggest influences driving people into the fandom, whether it's the newer generation of furries getting into it through Zootopia, or the older generation getting into it through Disney's Robin Hood or The Lion King. The point is, Disney is responsible for more furries than, well, most other sources on the planet. Not just in North America, but sort of around the world. This is some of our East Asian participants sent to us by Gao. And you can see here that in a Malaysian sample and a Taiwanese sample, from Thailand, from Japan, you see the influences of Disney and Disney-esque movies and companies influencing what drove a person to become interested in the furry fandom. So fun fact number 4, Despite the fact that they seem like the same thing, furries and bronies, that's adult My Little Pony fans, are not quite the same thing. This was a bigger deal a few years ago when the brony fandom was kind of at its peak. There's a big debate. There was a big debate in the furry fandom about whether or not furries counted as bronies or vice versa. This is notable because, depending on the sample you use, between 10 and 20% of furries will call themselves bronies. And in the research we've done on bronies, about 20 to 25% of bronies would call themselves furries, which means that there is some overlap between the fandom, but they also see themselves as kind of separate. Being a brony doesn't necessarily make you a furry, and being a furry doesn't guarantee you're going to like the show My Little Pony. What's interesting is that with the show My Little Pony ending, it ended last year, you have a whole contingent of bronies who are looking for a place to go. Right? They're looking for a place where their continued interest in the show will carry on and be acceptable. And it's likely that at least some of them will find a home in the furry fandom, a place where you can be a fan of Disney's Robin Hood or The Lion King from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and it's still kind of cool. You can still share and keep that interest alive with other fans. So that's an interesting development as we look forward to the future. Fun fact number 5, furries get immersed into stories more if they have furry characters in them. So if you take some kind of a show and you slap a furry character, a walking, talking animal character in it, furries will tend to find it more engaging, more immersive. Certainly that was the case in this study that we ran, where we asked furries how much do you get sucked into a story if it's got furry characters or not. And as a general rule, furries got more sucked into the stories with furry characters in them, in part because it's relevant to their interest. If you like this stuff, it's going to be relevant to you. In the same way that if you happen to be gay and a story has a gay character in it, well, you're going to find that story more compelling just because it speaks to you on more levels. So fun fact number 6, not only do furries get more drawn into furry-themed media, but furries, like everyone else, are influenced by the media that they consume. This is research based on something that we did a few years ago. Looking in this case, it happened to be at fans of My Little Pony, and what we found was that viewing My Little Pony, a show with these pro-social positive messages compared to other shows, like in this case we used Rooster Teeth fans for comparison, fans of an internet video-based series, the fans of My Little Pony, as a result of, what we speculate is a result of consuming this media with a pro-social message, it actually was associated with more empathy and more charitable behavior. Right? So the idea behind this is that we are influenced by the things we watch. You are what you watch, in a way. And so, whereas I can say that I'm watching My Little Pony for research purposes, you can say that you're watching My Little Pony or consuming media with pro-social messages because it makes you a better person. So you're welcome for that. So furries like furry media, and they are influenced by whatever is in their furry media. So fun fact number 7, furries have an active imagination, a healthy sense of fantasy. This is a paper that I published several years ago in the journal Basic and Applied Social Psychology, and we basically made a distinction between what we call positive fantasy and negative fantasy. Positive fantasy is fantasy that's associated with good things, right? It's a muse, it's self-expression. Negative fantasy being excessive fantasy or blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. And what we find is that furries have more of this healthy fantasy than non-furries do, but they don't score significantly higher in this more negative, pathological kind of fantasy. So furries definitely have more active fantasy lives. They have very vibrant and vivid imaginations, but it's not causing them to lose touch with reality. So fun fact number 8, most furries have a fursona. So a fursona is this walking, talking, animal representation of yourself, this anthropomorphized animal character that furries use to represent themselves, sometimes, as you see here, to horrifying effects. We find that most furries have a fursona. For the most part, 95% or more of furries have had at least one fursona in their life. Most of the time it's one. In cases where furries have had more than one, it's more often than not the case that it's one after another in sort of a serial fashion. It's unusual but not unheard of. About 20% of furries will say that they have had more than one fursona at a time, where they sort of switch between fursonas day to day. But for the most part, if you have had more than one, it tends to be in this slow serial fashion. Likewise, around the world, we tend to find that in most other samples, furries also report having something akin to a fursona, the exception to that rule perhaps being Japan. But for the most part, in these other areas, furries tend to say they have some kind of fursona or representation of themselves. Fun fact number 9, on the subject of fursonas, fursonas are very meaningful for most furries. Furries put a lot of themselves into their fursonas, which is why you don't see a lot of furries with 50 different fursonas. Furries don't wake up one morning and decide, hey, I'm a dog, hey, I'm a cat, hey, I'm a bear. Furries tends to take their fursonas pretty seriously and put a lot of thought into it. We find, for example, that when we ask furries, hey, is your fursona very different from you or very similar to you? Furries say that their fursona reflects them very deeply, right? It's almost identical to them. And since we as people don't change overnight, our fursonas typically don't change overnight as well. This was very much the same in most of our other samples as well. So when you look at the Southeast Asian data here, again collected by our friend Gao, you can see here that across these samples, with the exception being Japan, furries tended to agree that their fursona was very similar or identical to them, more than to say that their fursona had nothing to do with them. Fun fact number 10, again related to this idea of fursonas. Not only do furries create fursonas that are similar to themselves, but they create fursonas that are similar but better than themselves. So in this figure, it reflects some data where we asked participants, hey, is your fursona an idealized or better version of you? Is it a worse version of you? Is it the kind of version that people say you ought to be? And what you see with the blue bars is that furries were much more likely to say their fursona is like a better idealized version of themselves. And when we ask furries, hey, is your fursona a worse version of yourselves, the green bars show furries overwhelmingly disagree with this idea. Your fursona tends to be a you, but a better looking, funnier, happier, sillier, more likable version of you that you sometimes strive for. And again, across the different samples here, we see very much in the same lines across the furries around the world tend to agree that their fursona is a better idealized version of themselves. So fun fact, number 11, furries tend to borrow elements of other furries' fursonas in the development of their own fursona, and furries are pretty okay with that. When we ask furries, hey, do you think that should we set a rule that says you're not supposed to base your fursona on someone else's fursona? Furries overwhelmingly disagreed with that. They said, no, there's nothing wrong with basing parts of your fursona on someone else's fursona if you think it's cool or interesting to look at. Likewise, when we ask straight up, hey, is it okay to take elements of other people's fursonas and integrate them into your own? Furries overwhelmingly said, yeah, go for it. When asked if they personally had done that, most furries said no. So furries are pretty okay with the idea of borrowing or taking inspiration from other fursonas, although many don't do that. They are okay with it, though. Fun fact, number 12 here. Furries are not therians. So you may have heard the term therian. A lot of furries kind of conflate the ideas or don't know what the term means, so we'll kind of clear the air here. A furry, as we're defining it here, is a fan. It's a person who has an interest in media that features anthropomorphized animals. So what's a therian? Well, a therian isn't a fan. They're a person who self-identifies as a non-human animal. So they say there's something not human inside of them, whether it's being trapped in a human body or having the spirit or the mindset of an animal. The point is something about them feels not entirely human. That's what makes a therian a therian. Furries typically don't respond. They feel not entirely human. It's also worth noting that while these are distinct definitions, while furries and therians are different things, there is some overlap between them. About 7% of furries call themselves therians as well. So you can sort of think of it like this. There are furries, there are therians, and there are some furries who are also therians as well. And again, this matters because depending on the questions we ask, we're going to get different responses from furries and therians. For example, if we ask, do you ever feel not entirely 100% human? About 35% of furries will say yes to that question, but 86% of therians will say yes to that question. So depending on the kinds of questions we're asking, it's important for us to know whether we're looking at furries or therians, and that's why we can't just treat them as one and the same. So, fun fact number 13. No, therians aren't just making it up. This is a question we sometimes get asked. Are therians saying, oh, I feel not entirely human, just for attention, just to feel special or different? And the answer is no. We've done a study which has been published in Anthrozoos, in which we did a reaction time task, looking at the way the minds of furries and therians worked. And what we found is that on this reaction time task, which is pretty difficult to fake, we found that there were actual measurable differences in how furries and therians responded when asked to categorize things like, animal, animal, human, animal, and then words like you, stranger, you, not human. And what we found is that essentially for therians, the concept of me or myself is tied up with the concept of animal. Right? So at the very level, the basic level of how their mind is working, they are tying the concept of me with not human animal, which might explain the very strong feelings that they have about, I'm a non-human animal. So fun fact number 14, fursonas are usually anthropomorphized animals, not real animals. So it's very rare to find a furry who's just a generic wolf that looks like a wolf. More often than not, when we ask furries, hey, is your fursona completely feral, completely like an animal, or completely anthropomorphized, or somewhere in the middle, furries tend to say that their fursona is much more on the anthropomorphized side of things, which again makes sense because furries aren't fans of animals, they're fans of anthropomorphized animals, remember. Fun fact number 15, when it comes to fursona species, across time, across pretty much every sample we've run, wolves and foxes are fairly consistently the most popular fursona species, which doesn't mean that everyone is a wolf or a fox. There are certainly house cats, my fursona being one of them. There are rabbits. There are dogs and birds and insects and scalies and dragons. There are all sorts of species out there, but pretty consistently, wolves and foxes are the most popular fursona species. And again, around the world, when we look at these samples, we see wolves dominate around the world wherever you go. Every sample seems to have wolves as being the most popular fursona species, with other species tending to jockey for second, third, fourth place, usually some combination of foxes, dogs, cats, and dragons fighting over second, third, and fourth place. Fun fact number 16, there are stereotypes that exist about different fursona species. Some of you may have heard some stereotypes about foxes as a species. We've actually tested to see what some of these stereotypes are, and we've found, for example, that the stereotype of wolves is that they are loyal. The stereotype of foxes is that they are sly or cunning or tricky. The stereotype of dragons is that they are strong. They're all about power. The stereotype of cats, kind of mixed, but the defining feature seems to be laziness, which, as a cat furry, I'm a little bit upset about. Dogs, again, associated with loyalty. Oh, everyone shed a tear for Seymour here. Aw. Rabbits, associated with shyness, with being timid. That's the stereotype of a rabbit. Otters, pretty one-dimensional. Otters, as it turns out, are all about having fun. So these are the stereotypes, but are there any truth to these stereotypes? Is it actually the case that people who pick wolf fursonas are actually more loyal people? And so that was the question we asked, and we ran a study to test whether or not these stereotypes were actually true. And what we found was that some of them are true, but some of them were not. Some of the ones we found truth to were the fact that wolves and dogs, people who have those as fursona species, do tend to describe themselves as more loyal people. People who describe themselves as foxes did tend to see themselves as sly and cunning. Bears and wolves were associated with being strong, which some people associate those species with. Foxes and bears were more likely to be men, whereas cats were more likely to be women. So the whole idea of the cat girl in anime seems to hold at least a little bit of water in the fandom. But there were also some surprising stereotypes as well that some people might not have predicted. For example, despite the fact that foxes are often treated as the promiscuous species in the fandom, it turns out wolves and dogs actually tended to be the most promiscuous. They had the most sex. They were also the most likely to be in a long-term relationship, so it's probably no coincidence, because studies in general show that people in relationships tend to have more sex. And as it turns out, rabbits weren't the species most associated with shyness. That, as it turns out, would be foxes. So, yeah, when it comes to these stereotypes, some of them are true, but some of them don't hold any water when you scrutinize or study them. And even the ones that are true, they tend to be fairly small differences. Fun fact, number 17, most furries aren't speciesist. It's not the case that furries judge each other on the basis of their fursona species. Certainly when we asked furries, hey, would you treat another person differently because you knew what their fursona species was? That's the blue bars here. And the furry said, no, just because someone's a dog fursona or has a cat fursona, I'm not going to treat them differently. But they do feel, when you look at the red and the green bars here, they do feel that it tells you something about that person. So furries think, if I know you're a cat fursona, that tells me a bit about you, but I wouldn't treat you differently just because of your fursona species. So fun fact, number 18, most furries don't own a fursuit, despite the fact that we hear about fursuits all the time in the media, and we show off and talk about fursuits all the time. The reality is that most furries don't own a fursuit. Only about 28% of furries worldwide actually owns a fursuit. So despite the fact that sometimes people call furries those people who wear fursuits, the reality is most furries don't have a fursuit. So it's kind of incorrect to define furries as people who wear fursuits, because you're missing most of the fandom with that definition. Also, about 8% of furries create fursuits, so they've tried at least once to create a fursuit themselves. Fun fact, number 19, fursuiters differ a little bit from non-fursuiting furries. So we can ask, well, what kind of a person puts on a fursuit, and what makes them different? We tend to find that compared to non-fursuiting furries, fursuiters tend to describe themselves as being a little more furry, more into the fandom, which doesn't mean that a fursuit makes you more furry, but rather if you are going to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a fursuit, you're probably already a person who's more into the fandom. A person who's kind of just casually into the fandom probably wouldn't spend that kind of money on a fursuit. Women tend to fursuit more likely than men. Fursuiters tend to have even more vivid and active fantasy lives than do non-fursuiters. Fursuiters are less likely to describe furry as a fetish for them than non-fursuiting furries are. So despite the idea that, fursuiters are people who want to have sex in those fursuits, fursuiters are actually less likely than the average furry to describe furry as a fetish for them. Fursuiters drink more, and not just water, although you should because you become dehydrated, but fursuiters also drink more alcohol. They party a little bit more. What's also interesting is that fursuiters tend to say they have more problems socializing with people outside of their fursuit. So the fursuit can sometimes be a bit of a crutch to help them interact with others. Fun fact, number 20, furries have a neat little ability, and that ability is being able to recognize furry faces and fursuit faces better than the average person. Someone had asked us once, hey, are furries really bad at recognizing human faces? So when we did a study and we compared furries and college students when it came to recognizing human faces, furries did just as well. But what furries were really good at was recognizing and distinguishing furry faces and fursuit faces. So furries just have sort of a special ability because of their experience to distinguish between different animals and different fursuit faces, but it's not to the detriment of their ability to recognize human faces. So fun fact number 21, the fandom is full of content creators. The furry fandom is a participatory culture, which means unlike other fandoms where one or two people get to decide what's canon in the fandom, in the furry fandom, right, there's no centralized organizing force. There are thousands of small independent content creators. Speaking to this point, 38% of furries do some kind of visual arts, 29% do some kind of writing, 17% are musicians, and 8% are YouTube creators. So yeah, furries do a lot of content creation, right? Not one person deciding for everyone, hey, here's the furry art that we're all going to agree is the canon of the fandom. Fun fact number 22, when you look at furry artists, like fursuiters, furry artists tend to be a little bit different from other furries. Namely the fact that furry artists are more likely to be women than to be men. They are much more likely to be transgender or gender nonconforming. There is research suggesting, a furry had once asked, could you look at a piece of art and figure out the gender of the person? We tested that. Absolutely not. Furries are terrible at doing this. You might as well roll a die because furries just can't seem to do that from the style. Most of the time, artists were artists before they were furries, so they've been doing art for years and then stumbled into the fandom, but they typically identified as artists first. Artists tend to congregate together, so if you're a furry artist, statistically about half of your friends are also furry artists. And despite the misconception that the furry fandom is all about sex, only about 17 to 18% of artists say that most of the work they produce is erotic in nature. Fun fact number 23, furries spend a lot of money on a lot of different things. We always talk about fursuits as being the thing that furries spend money on, but as it turns out, furries spend a lot of money in general. The blue bars here represents, when we ask furries, how much have you spent in the last 12 months on these topics, and red bar says, how much would you be willing to spend if you could? What we see here is that furries tend to spend several $100s a year on average on things like artwork, whether it's physical arts or digital art, which furries tend to be more willing to spend money on. Erotic artwork, furry supports other furries on Patreon, typically to the tune of about $50 a year. But artwork pales in comparison to other things they spend money on. Arguably the biggest of which is furry conventions. So furries spend a lot of money going to conventions. Paraphernalia can be things like fursuits and other things like that. Furries spend a lot of money on their hobby, right? But convention seems to be the biggest expense. Fun fact, number 24, furries do things besides just being furry. It's easy to look at a bunch of furries and say, well, okay, furry is the defining feature of their life. But as it turns out, furries belong to all kinds of other groups as well. Most furries are gamers and science fiction fans. There's a lot of anime fans and writers and artists and content creators and even sport fans and My Little Pony fans and musicians. There's a lot of different subgroups within the furry fandom. And indeed, in our Southeast Asian, the Southeast Asian sample that Gao collected for us, when they asked furries, hey, what are your hobbies? You can see that gaming seems to be popular around the world, followed by things like manga, sketching, food. Food is apparently quite popular. Furries need to eat, and in some places, food is tied in much more closely to furry interactions and what furries do. Fun fact number 25, furries interact with each other predominantly online. So furries spend a lot of time as an online culture, with about 80% of furries saying they make it out to some kind of forum or furry website. And 80% of furries say they use instant messaging programs like Telegram, Discord. That number is probably higher nowadays. This was asked back a few years ago. Nowadays, as Telegram has grown as a program, more and more furries are using it.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Furry Fandom. Dr. Roberts here. I am sorry that I have interrupted Dr. Nuka's fabulous presentation. I'm sure you're enjoying it, as am I. But I thought we could just take a second to have a little chat. A lot of people ask us, how do we support Furscience? Well, I mean, the obvious thing is participate in our research, and we really thank you and appreciate that every time people do it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But the other way that people can really support Furscience is by engaging in our social media. And by that, I mean Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and of course YouTube by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Why? Why would that matter, you might ask? Well, our funders care about how we are disseminating information, and the more reach that we have through social media, the better we're doing our jobs. So please go to our social media. I'll wait right now. You go right ahead. Just go on YouTube.
One eternity later.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now we go back to Dr. Plante.
So furries interact predominantly online. That's sort of the first main way that they interact, because sometimes you may not realize where a nearby furry is. Sometimes you may be the only furry in your little town. So furries often rely on the internet to meet and find one another. Fun fact number 26, furries spend a lot of time online, but they also meet up at furry conventions all over the world. This is a furry convention, for example, in Brazil. At these furry conventions, about 1 in 3 furries say that they make it out to some kind of local meetup. So for restaurant meets or just house parties kind of thing. About half of furries say that they make it out to at least one convention per year. Because again, look around the world, there's arguably a furry convention within driving or maybe a short plane ride away from you. And to this end, we find that about 95% of furries say they've made it out to at least one furry convention over the course of their life. So about half of furries make it out to one convention or more per year, and 95% of furries have been to a convention at least once. Fun fact number 27, furries act differently at these conventions than they do in their real lives. Right? So when you want to ask what goes on at a convention that makes it so different from the real world, from how you act around your friends or your family or your colleagues, well, at furry conventions, furries say they're more likely to hug and cuddle and be physically affectionate. They're more likely to show off their furry merchandise, to share furry jokes and memes, to sometimes let loose and act like an animal, to growl or roar or be silly animals. But in general, we tend to find that furries say they're more outgoing at conventions. It's where they open up and become more social than perhaps they are in their day-to-day life. So, fun fact number 28. You may have heard of the term post-con depression, a depression that you get after going to a convention. If you've never been to a convention, or if you're at one of your first conventions soon, post-con depression is totally a thing. We studied it at Anthrocon a few years ago, where we studied furries at Anthrocon and then followed up with them a few days later after they went home. And sure enough, we found that in going back home, furries tend to feel less happy and everything feels like more of an effort to them. They feel unmotivated and depressed and bummed out. So you do tend to see this kind of crash in your mood after attending a convention, which is one of the reasons why we say, hey, get in touch with people, get contact information, and stay in touch after the convention to help combat this. Fun fact number 29, most furries are not straight. As it turns out, when you ask furries about their sexual orientation, only about 20% of furries identify as straight, with about half of furries identifying as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, between 8 and 10% of furries identifying as asexual, and another 15% identifying as pansexual. So furries kind of run the gamut, the entire spectrum of sexual orientation. Fun fact number 30, furries are in relationships, whether they're straight, gay, or whatever you're into. Furries tends to find themselves in relationships, many of them at least. We tend to find here that across our samples, about anywhere from half to 2/3 of furries say they are currently single, with about 1/3 or so saying that they're in relationships. This often depends on the sex of the participant. We find, for example, that male furries are much more likely to be single than are female furries, who are much more likely to be in a relationship already. But it also depends on whether you split it up by being straight or being gay. We find, for example, that among gay furries in particular, they tend to find their partner through the furry fandom. So if you're a gay male furry in a fandom that's predominantly male and has a number of gay or bisexual people in it, it's kind of a target-rich environment for you. There's a lot of potential partners there for you. In a way that may not be the case if you are a straight male furry looking for a partner. You may be better off looking to another fandom to maybe find a potential partner and then get them interested in furries. Fun fact number 31, there's also a lot of trans furries. in the furry fandom. Now, when we ask these questions about sex and gender, you have to ask them in nuanced ways. We're guilty early on, and when we first started doing research, we're guilty of doing what a lot of social scientists do, which is check the box. Are you male or female? We don't do that anymore. We've taken a lot of feedback and a lot of input from LGBTQ groups, and now we ask in many different ways. We ask people, hey, here's a bunch of different boxes. Check off any of the ones that apply to you. We have many, many more options. We also give people a chance to write in their own options. And what we tend to find is these numbers tend to show that about 73.4% of furries identify as cis males, about 12.6% identify as cis female, and about 13.1% identify as trans, which is remarkable when you consider that in the general population, that number is about 0.6%. So in the furry fandom, we see numbers more than 20 times what you find in the general population of trans people. So it is a fairly significant part of the furry fandom. So fun fact, number 32 on this subject, LGBTQ furries often get a lot more out of the fandom than just entertainment. There's a lot more to it for them. Among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and asexual furries, they tend to report using the furry fandom as a means of escapism, right, to escape some of the bigotry or stigma they experience in their day-to-day life. They identify much more strongly with their fursona than straight furries do on average. They tend to seek help and to give help in the furry fandom more often, and they tend to experience more anxiety in their day-to-day lives. Looking at trans furries in the fandom, compared to cisgender furries in the fandom, trans furries are, as I mentioned before, more likely to be artists, also more likely to be therians. Trans furries identify much more strongly with their fursonas, in part because if you're struggling to sort of have your physical body manifest as the way your gender identity manifests, a fursona can be a really useful way to have others see you the way you want to be seen. Moreover, trans furries are more likely to seek help and receive help from the furry fandom, but also to offer help as well. So fun fact number 33, furries experience a lot of stigma. They get picked on quite a bit in the media. It's not hard to find examples online of people picking on furries. When we study bullying in furries, we find that furries are much more likely to have a history of being bullied, not just currently, but also in the past, going back to their teenage years. About 62% of furries report significant bullying when they were younger, as compared to 40% of non-furries. And we're not just talking about being sort of taunted or made fun of, we're talking about being physically beaten up too in many cases. And this is even after controlling statistically for the fact that furries are more likely to be gay or transgender, which also earns you a lot of stigma. In the Russian sample that was provided to us by Saren, or by Dmitry rather, Russian furries report a lot of this sort of assumptions that people make about them when they find out that they are furry. For example, about 68% of furries say that people, when they hear that they're a furry, people assume they're a zoophile, that they're sexually attracted to animals. About half of furries say that people assume that they have a mental disorder just by being furry. 42% say that people assume they're gay just because they're a furry. 42% say that people assume they're a sexual deviant because they are a furry. And 36% say that people assume they are a corrupter of the youth, and that they're somehow corrupting youth by being furries. So it should surprise no one, based on this research, that when we ask furries, hey, if people knew that you were a furry, would they disapprove? Compared to other fan groups we've studied, like anime fans or sport fans, furries are the most likely to say, yeah, if someone found out I was a furry, they wouldn't take it very well. So fun fact number 34, the furry fandom shelters, protects, and ultimately has saved the lives of many furries. Because we know from research that a history of bullying and being picked on is one of the worst things you can do for a person's psychological and physical well-being. And yet when we compare furries to non-furries, furries look the same as anyone else with respect to their well-being. And we think a good explanation for this has to do with the fandom itself. That furries find other furries in the fandom who become their social support network. So when life is tough and the chips are down, furries have this community of people who are there for them. And that's one of the best predictors of health and well-being. So in a journal article that we published a few years ago, we had this lovely quote from a furry in one of our studies that I think nicely summarizes it here. If you feel unaccepted, if you've contemplated suicide, I've had those dark times. I was seriously contemplating it, and once I found the fandom, it saved me. I want people to know that we may seem weird, but there's always someone to help and accept you here. And that, in a nutshell, is why we think the furry fandom is this big protective force. And fun fact number 35, related to that idea, well, community in this sense of fandom is the biggest reason to be a furry. When we ask furries, hey, why are you a furry? And we ask them to list the reasons, we see that the number one reason, even more important than the art itself, is the sense of community and belongingness that it provides. That's what drives furries to being furries and being involved in the furry fandom, is because of that sense of community. So number 36, as a group, furries tend to be fairly young. So in our own research, we're not allowed to study minors. And what we find is this distribution that looks like this. A lot of furries in their late teens, early 20s, and as you get older, it tends to fall off quite a bit. Now, we can't study minors, but other people who aren't us have been able to study minors, and you see pretty much the same distribution. A lot of furries in their late teens and early 20s, and then it falls off as you get into your 20s, your late 20s, your 30s and 40s, which is not to say there aren't furries who are well into their 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s. Right? People have been going to furry conventions since the 1980s at least. So number 37, related to this idea of age in the fandom, ageism is totally a thing. Ageism, that is treating people differently on the basis of their age. And what we tend to find, this data suggests here, that furries tend to like to hang out with people their own age. If you're a younger furry, you want to hang out with younger furries, not older furries. If you're an older furry, you tend to want to hang out with older furries, not younger furries. And if you're between the age of 25 and 35, that's a pretty sweet spot to be in. 25 in particular, it seems to be like the place to be. Everyone wants to hang out with 25-year-old furries. Fun fact number 38, the furry fandom demographically isn't really getting older. And what I mean by that is that when you look over time, compared to other fandoms like the brony fandom, where you see over 5 or 6 years, the average brony getting about 5 or 6 years older, in the furry fandom, it tends to be a fairly flat line. Right? As time goes on, the furry fandom only slightly creeps up in age, which suggests one of two things is happening. It could be the case that older furries are leaving the fandom, which keeps it kind of young, or it could be the case that younger furries keep pouring into the fandom. The fandom is growing predominantly from the influx of younger furries, and that tends to squash down the average age of the furry fandom as it continues to stay young on average. Fun fact 39, furries come from all walks of life, including religious backgrounds. So in our North American samples, we tend to find that furries are about 1/3 atheist agnostic, 1/4 Christian, about 10 to 11% pagan or Wiccan, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. And what we find is that the religious composition of the fandom largely depends on the culture that you're a part of, right? So furries in Taiwan will have a very different religious makeup than furries from Thailand or Japan or Malaysia, reflecting the dominant religious beliefs of people that age in those countries. So furry isn't really tied to any one religion or lack thereof. Fun fact number 40, related to the idea of religion, furries come from all walks of life politically, although there tends to be a bit of a liberal slant to the furry fandom. So when and this data was predominantly taken in North America, so keep it with a grain of salt there. But we tend to find that furries tend to identify, they're more likely to identify as liberal as opposed to conservative. When we talk about liberalism, we're talking specifically about social liberalism. So furries tend to lead more to the liberal side when it comes to things like trans rights and gay rights, in no small part because furries are, mostly non-straight. So furries tend to be fairly progressive on social issues like that. When it comes to economic issues, furries are fairly divided. They tend to be fairly down the middle, debating about things like whether or not healthcare should be privatized, debating on things like welfare programs. But at least on social issues, furries tend to be fairly liberal. Fun fact number 41, furry drama is totally a thing. And if you ask, well, how do you study furry drama? We've actually asked hundreds of furries to give their definition of drama, and we've extracted some common things. Drama tends to have three things. It tends to involve conflict between two or more people. It tends to be something small that gets blown out of proportion, and it tends to happen in public, right? So either online or at a con or in a place where other people are around, which causes it to blow out of proportion. So these are kind of the ingredients, the catalysts for drama happening in the fandom. And it's easy to trivialize drama. It's easy to laugh about drama and say, oh, lol, drama, that's just a furry thing. But the reality is that drama is the second biggest cause of furries leaving the fandom. Right? So if we want the fandom to stay big and to stay vibrant and inclusive of a lot of people, we ought to be taking drama a little bit more seriously and maybe work towards reducing drama in the fandom. Fun fact number 42, with respect to things like drama, furries tend to assume that problem behavior or negative behavior is more common than it actually is. This is a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. When we ask furries, how much do you engage in these different activities? And then how much do you think the average furry engages in these activities? We tend to find overwhelmingly that furries assume that other furries drink and smoke and party and use drugs and engage in more risky sex than they do. Right? So furries assume other furries are misbehaving a lot more than furries actually are when you survey them. So it suggests that a few vibrant cases or a few notable cases seems to cause people to overestimate how prominent these things are. You hear one story about a furry who gets really drunk and makes an ass of themselves at a convention, and you assume that's much more common than it actually is in the fandom. Fact number 43, furries are not deviants per se. When I say that, I mean that statistically furries are deviants. Statistically, furries are unusual. Right? Furries are fairly rare in the general population, so they are statistical deviants. But with respect to things like, are they more violent? Are they maladjusted? Do they have mental illness? We don't seem to find any evidence for this. In many respects, furries are actually better adjusted than a typical person. One thing we have noticed in our research is that furries are much more likely to be on the autism spectrum than the general population. Although we don't think that's unique to furries, when we study fan groups in general, we tend to find higher rates of people on the spectrum there. And we think that part of the reason is because one of the defining features of being on the spectrum is a strong or a tendency to become interested in a very specific or narrow area. And what is a fan if not a person who has a very strong, focused interest in something specific? Fun fact number 44, furries as a group are nerds. We are geek culture, we are nerd culture, we spend a lot of time online, we have nerd interests. We see this reflected not just in our interests, but in our school performance. A lot of furries go to college or university. Most furries, in fact, are either currently in university or have gone to university already. And when you look at the school performance, furries tend to report grades in the high B's, low A's on average. So furries tend to be kind of nerdy. All right, this is the part of the lecture where I say the last few slides are going to be talking about sexuality and pornography. So if that sort of thing bothers you, might be the part where you want to tune out and leave. We're going to be respectful about it and we're going to be mature about it, but I did want to sort of give this caveat in case you're squicked out by that sort of thing. So, fun fact number 45, furry is a fandom for most furries, but a fetish for some furries. So when we ask furries, to what extent is furry a fetish for you, and then to what extent do you think the average furry considers it a fetish, we get some more of that pluralistic ignorance. The blue bars is your estimate, and we see that furries estimate that the average furry considers it to be a fetish a lot more than furries themselves actually consider it to be. But you do see a mixed bag, right? So about a quarter of furries say absolutely not a fetish. You probably get about another third of furries who say maybe a little bit of a fetish, and then probably another third of furries that say, no, it's pretty strongly a fetish for me. So furries are kind of a mixed mind when it comes to this, but certainly it's not the case that furry is a fetish for all furries. And again, I want to make clear right now, by the way, that saying it's a fetish or it's not a fetish is not in any way trying to be negative about fetishes, right? We take a sex-positive approach. There's nothing wrong with furry being a fetish for people. It's just not the case that furry is a fetish for everyone. Fun fact number 46, furries look at porn. Not a big surprise, hopefully, to anyone there. Pornography exists in the furry fandom. 96% of men in the furry fandom look at furry porn. 17% say the only porn they look at is furry. 78% of women in the fandom look at porn, and about 2.2% say the only porn they look at is furry. In general, we tend to find that men in the fandom have a more positive attitude towards porn. Women in the fandom tend to be a little bit more ambivalent. They have some mixed attitudes towards porn. When it comes to furry porn, it can be described as attraction to anthropomorphized animals. So on a 1 to 10 scale, when we ask furries, are you sexually attracted to anthropomorphized animal characters? You see a pretty definitive response here. Furries overwhelmingly say, yeah, that's what I'm into. This is important to note because some people will say, well, furries are zoophiles. Furries are people who are sexually attracted to animals. And yet when you run that data and ask, are you sexually attracted to real animals? It's an entirely different story. The two bars are completely the opposite, and the vast majority of furries say, no, I am not sexually attracted to real animals, which is to say that a small percentage of furries would call themselves zoophiles. That's that 7, 8, 9, 10 on the right side of the figure there. Those folks, you would say, probably do have strong sexual attraction to animals, definitely not the bulk of the furry fandom. Fun fact number 47, furries look at porn, they like porn, but they're not primarily motivated by it. Their interest in fandom isn't motivated just by porn. When we ask furries, hey, when you look at furry arts, do you only look at the non-pornographic stuff or the pornographic stuff? And what you see is a slight preference for the pornographic stuff. But for the most part, furries don't really have a strong preference. They just like furry art. And hey, if it's got a good-looking character, all the better. Just like if you like science fiction or if you like video games and there's a good-looking character in your video game or in your story, hey, all the better. And when we ask furry, hey, is porn the reason why you're a furry? Is porn predominantly why you're here? Which is what you'd expect to find if it were more of a fetish. We tend to find that for about 10 to 15% of furries, that's very much the case. Yeah, I'm here for the porn. That's what this is about for me. For the vast majority of furries, though, this really isn't the case. And again, if you remember from before, when we asked furries, why are you here? Community was one of the #1 reasons for it. And again, around the world, this tends to be the case. When you ask furries around the world, it's the art and the community that tends to drive the interest. Japan, again, being the exception. You see here that in Japan, fetish was the #2 reason to drive a person's furry motivation. So maybe in Japan, it would be accurate to say that furries are much more likely to be driven by a fetish than elsewhere in the world. Number 48, as you may have expected from furries being very interested in pornography and very open about this sort of thing, furries are very positive and open about sexuality and about kinks. So we asked furries, hey, list any kinks or fetishes you might have. We tend to find that about, depending on where you put the label, between 40 and 55% of furries would call themselves into BDSM. Bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism. Different people have different terminologies for those acronyms. We see other different fetishes as well, everything from vorophilia, the eating of your partner, to water sports, transformation, shape-shifting, all fairly popular fetishes or kinks. Well, I say fairly popular. Most furries don't have these, but among the kinks, they are some of the more popular ones. To address some of the ones that people often conflate with furries, we find that zoophilia is about 6.9% of furries identify as zoophiles. Again, it's important to note that the philia is different from the action. So just because approximately 7% say they are zoophiles, it does not mean that 7% have sex with animals. The attraction and the action are two very different things, something to keep in mind. Fun fact number 49, as we draw to a close here, I want to remind you that there is a place that you can go to learn more about furries. If you go to Furscience, furscience.com, our website, that's where you can find all of this information there. You can follow us on YouTube. All of this information, all of our new study information is available on our social media and on our website. We make this data available. All of our new findings get posted there. Any of our publications get posted there. Information about our up-and-coming studies, if you want to participate, are all available there as well. So definitely go check us out. And fun fact number 50, I have to say furry audiences are hands down the best audiences to give a talk to. I'm a professor. I teach for a living. And as much as I love teaching to students, I always get a kick out of teaching furries about themselves. So thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. It's always much more fun to interact with the audience live. But nevertheless, thank you for listening. I hope you'll check out our website and our social media. And I think if this plan has gone according to plan, I guess there should be time for some Q&A. So I'll turn it over to the folks running this thing to hopefully switch it over to some Q&A. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Furscience. You are now live, and thank you also for offering to answer our questions.
Sure. So if anyone's got any questions in the chat or whatnot, feel free to fire away, and we'll endeavor to answer them.
Buddy, it's Sharon. I'm here too.
Oh yeah, sorry, I completely
That's okay. I'm used to being forgotten. That's why I have to force my way into. By the way, did everybody remember to go on our social media and follow Furscience on social media?
All right, so we do have questions streaming in here.
Good.
Let's see. So Baboshi asks, how many furries are fat furs? That's what I want to know. I don't know. We haven't, I guess it depends on whether you're talking about the label of fat fur or whether you're talking about like a BMI sort of thing. We have asked about BMI in the past, although there's a lot of questionable thing, Dr. Roberts could probably tell you better about the BMI and all of the problems associated with its use.
BMI is a poor measure, although I mean it's just a basic place to start. And I think at one point we were starting to look into some of that. I think I came across some of that data just recently, and there seemed that there were some body image challenges that I think we could investigate a bit more in this, but we just got on to other research topics based on grants and things. So it's something that I'd like to come back to. I just haven't had a chance to do it yet.
But we haven't specifically asked about, again, if the label fat fur, we've not asked that before, although it's interesting. We could certainly ask about that in the future. So thank you for your question.
I wonder if there's a way to I would like to know more about the way that people are thinking about that terminology before we would begin on the process of asking that to make sure we're doing it right. So if anybody has any information on that, send it our way so we can get a bit of background. That'd be great.
Yep. And then we have Transmogrified. I'm assuming that's Transmogrified. Asks, what research would you like to do in the future? I'm a big fan of furry research myself, but so if you're talking about sort of specific topics, we actually, believe it or not, we're always planning kind of 6 months to a year ahead. So we've already got sort of research topics in mind for the March or April surveys that we're going to be asking about. And I can't speak for Sharon, but there's a bunch of things that I'm kind of interested in going forward, including we're hoping to put together something looking at racial minorities in the furry fandom. So we've got I got a colleague of mine in particular who is a sociology graduate student who studies race issues, and she'd like to sort of help us work together to try to get a better look at some of the experiences of racial minorities in the fandom. I'm particularly interested in looking more into things like spending habits, regretful spending in the fandom, and predictors of that sort of thing, as well as perhaps diving a little bit more into diving back more into the species stuff. I always say that I'm done with the species stuff, and then more stuff seems to pull me back into it. So I'm particularly interested in things like what, once more diving into the fray of, are there things that predict certain kinds of Fursona species? I'd like to get a bit more as well into the nuances of why you chose the species that you did. We've looked at it before in the past, but I think there's more to be tapped there if we can find the right way to ask about it. So I've got a million questions. Every time we answer one question, we have 3 new questions. So I've got those are kind of the areas that interest me most. I don't know about you, Dr. Shazzy.
Well, I'm interested in all those things that you said. I'm interested in hearing about your grad student that you've got working on the sociological aspects of racialization. I'm very interested in figuring out a bit more of that part of the fandom as well. I'm curious about seeing if the representation within the fandom is being captured adequately by our surveys. And I think one of the ways that we could do that would be partnering with the convention and working with them at the back end from the time before they are putting together their registration. And we'd have to have the ethics approval, of course, to do that. But I think it would be really interesting to see representation within the fandom, if that's being captured by our research, B, representation of con staff, and whether that's fair and equitable as well. I think those are some ongoing questions I think that came up out of all the political activities this summer that I'm very interested in following up on. And so I'm quite interested in what Nuka's got going on there. I'm also interested in trauma, and I'm trying to figure out good ways to study trauma ethically. So I'm in the what I hope to God is the last term of an MSW at this point, that I've been picking off for about 4 years part-time to be able to be better qualified to do that. I'm dedicated enough to this idea of studying trauma and what I believe is resiliency within the fandom, probably navigated through Fursona. That I wanted to do it ethically and got a degree, or almost got a degree, another one to just all
that's
that.
commitments.
So those are some of the things that I'm. So one of those things that I've been, you do 12 years of school. What's another 4, right? So
yeah. I wanted to mention one more thing too before we go to the next question. One of the things I've been really interested lately too is in generation gaps. I found some really interesting qualitative data in the last survey, looking at when there are discrepancies between younger furries and older furries. What do they fight about? What do they disagree about? And we're starting to see some interesting trends there. If you pay attention to our research next year, we're going to be focusing a lot more on questions of why do these generational rifts exist? How big are they? What sorts of things amplify them? So stay tuned for that. Let's see. So Mr. Squeezable asks, have you done research in depth with other types of with other types of fandoms and cultures, and if so, how do they compare to the furry fandom?
The answer to that is yes.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yes. A lot of the work that I do with, or that we do rather, with Dr. Stephen Rayson, for example, we do studies on anime fans and the My Little Pony fandom. Those are kind of the big ones. We also occasionally do research with Star Wars fans. Typically, as students of ours become interested in studying other fan groups, we end up branching off and looking at more. We published a book on the brony fandom, which is available, and we are currently in the process of publishing a book on the anime fandom as well. So we've studied them in probably not quite as much depth as the furry fandom. We've been studying furries for, I think over 10 years now at this point. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Dr. Grabasi, she's been studying it for another 3 or 4 on top of that. So we've been doing that for the longest. In terms of how do they compare to the furry fandom, the general rule, at least from a psychological perspective, is that these fandoms are largely interchangeable, right? So what we tend to find is that fandom is fandom is fandom. They often scratch many of the same psychological itches for people. So if people have a need for human interaction, and so whether you're an anime fan or a furry fan or a sports fan, right, the people you engage in your activity with provides that social support. People often have a need for self-esteem, right? So the fandom, regardless of what you're a fan of, provides that sense of self-esteem for people. So from a psychological perspective, many of the same itches get scratched across these different fan groups. So in that regard, they're kind of interchangeable. But there are little idiosyncrasies that make each fandom kind of unique. So we find in the My Little Pony fandom and the furry fandom, for example, pro-social values are really, really strong in those fandoms. They're strongly associated, especially among bronies, for example, with things like charitable behavior and donating blood and such. Whereas you might not see that to the same extent in the sports fandom, but in the sports fandom, they may be a little bit more about things like, I don't know, working out and athleticism or something. So there's little idiosyncrasies that make each fandom different. But the general rule is they tend to have more in common than they have differences, which is also why you see so much overlap between these fandoms. It's not too difficult for a furry to also move into the anime fandom, move into the science fiction fandom or the fantasy fandom. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Sharon, or...
I think that's pretty fair. I've been just delving into some of the things around bullying for actually this book on the anime fandom, and I've been doing some comparisons of furries and anime fans specifically. And although there are differences in bullying between these two groups, the self-esteem is pretty equitable among them. So that's one thing. I noticed that the furry fandom seems to also have better identity resolution. And that's always been something that's really interesting to me. And I think it has to do with the self-created identity that furries engage in. So there's a lot of deep reflective sort of introspective work that goes into figuring out like the details of Fursona. So, that little freckle that's on someone's Fursona, it has a story behind it. And there's like a reason why it's there. And those details have been really, have been processed and thought about. And I think that the community piece is similar, but that self-created identity piece that is unique to furries, I think has added benefits to it over some of the other, what we would call other created identity. So if you're an anime fan, it's typical for you to cosplay as, favorite character. And that's, it's a creative exercise. It has benefits to it. But the uniqueness of the Fursona development and the identity elements to it are pretty magnificent, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a caveat to all of this is we're always talking about sort of average tendencies. So obviously in the anime fandom, even though there's a lot of cosplaying, people do also create their own characters. In the My Little Pony fandom, a lot of people create their own OCs. So it's not the case that these are completely unique to the furry fandom, just you see a lot more of it in the furry fandom than in these other fandoms.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Speaking in averages, depending on your standard deviations, of course, is going to give you a lot of variability. But yes, yeah. I agree. Thanks for saying that.
Yep. Let's see. Transmogrified says, question from Kit. You said that furries have positive imagination lives. How do you define and measure positive fantasy versus pathologic fantasy? I'm glad you asked. I created the scale and published a paper on that a few years ago.
He has an entire dissertation on this.
Yeah. I spent many years working on this. So the gist of it is, there's no one perfect way to measure something as abstract as fantasies. What we've done is instead look sort of at the consequences of it. What I wanted to do was develop a scale that said, because too often people get caught up in what are you fantasizing about? Or people will often say, well, it's a bad fantasy if it involves, killing, that's a bad fantasy. But if it involves, petting a cat, that's a good fantasy. But if it's, people make distinctions based on the content. Oh, you like a show about fuzzy cartoon horses, but you're an adult, that makes it a bad fantasy. And the argument we've always said is that it matters less what you're fantasizing about and more why you're engaging in it. What function is it serving for you? And so when we talk about positive and pathological fantasy, our definition of positive fantasy is it having positive effects for you? So some of the questions ask about, do you use fantasy for self-expression? Is it a muse for you? Do you engage in it with other people? Is it for fun? Is it for entertainment? Does it help you relax? Those sorts of things. Whereas pathological fantasy is more characterized by this solely by escapism, right? So when we think about pathological fantasy, I always picture the World of Warcraft fan who can't make rent this month, and so they're putting on World of Warcraft just so they don't have to think about it, right? We tend to find that with pathological fantasy, it's less about being immersed in an engaging and exciting world and more about like a coping mechanism. Like, this is the thing that gets me through the day. It also tends to have a more addictive quality to it. This idea of it's a compulsion. It's a thing I do and I can't really stop. versus something that's more entertaining to you. So our questions tend to tap in those different elements. Can you stop if you wanted to? Is it causing problems with your day-to-day functioning? Do your friends and family have concerns about how much you're doing it? That tends to be the sorts of things that characterize the more pathological form of the fantasy engagement. Whereas the more positive form, you tend to see benefits from it. So that's sort of the simple way that we went and tried to measure it. It is by far not the only way, nor will I claim that it is the right or proper way to do it. Rather, it's just for our purposes in trying to distinguish healthy fantasy from less healthy fantasy in a way that doesn't just look at the content. That was sort of the easiest way we could think of to do it. And again, there's a whole, if you go to the Furscience website and look at our publications, there's an entire published study with 4 or 5 validation studies built into it, getting at this scale that I built to try to tap into the differences between these different kinds of fantasies. So the nerd in me, the science nerd, thanks you for taking such a keen interest in the psychometric properties of these scales. Okay, so Blue Nadir asks, I'm a bit late to the party due to time zone differences, so this may have been covered. But have you delved into the social acceptance of the furry fandom in different countries? They are from South Africa. So good question. Much of our data tends to be centered in more Western countries. So all of the researchers here are from Canada or the United States, and much of our data collection comes from cons at United States or Canada. Although recently we've been able to make it to Eurofurence, and we were supposed to go to Confuzzled this year, but alas, this pandemic you may have heard of going on. We have also been doing international online studies, though. So in our most recent online study, for example, I think 15 or 20% of our sample came from Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe and such. So we're slowly starting to get more and more data from other regions of the world. What I can say by supplementing our data with data, for example, from Russia or from Eastern Europe, data that was collected by someone who wasn't us, but who's been working with us, they found that bullying and bullying and stigma tends to be just as common there, from what we can tell, as you find elsewhere. So at least comparing sort of an Eastern European sample to a North American sample, you tend to get that. Anecdotally speaking, we can say that in places like Japan, we've had furries from Japan talk to us about the idea that you don't so much see as like furry conventions. Furry gatherings tend to be much more small and localized. Like, hey, a bunch of furries might go over to their friend's house, but you wouldn't necessarily go out and have a parade or go take over a bowling alley or something. It's a topic we'd really like to be able to have the data to study. And so I think going forward, we've talked before about wanting to go to Japan and do a study in Japan. We've talked about trying to nail down more thorough or larger rather samples of people from other parts of the world. Part of that is also limited by the fact that we only speak English in our current group. So one of the best ways if we want to get data in other languages and from other countries is to find translators and furries who are willing to help us localize our study into other countries. I know when we went to Eurofurence, a number of very kind German furries were happy to help us translate our questions into German. And we had our very first German survey, which allowed us to collect a bunch of data from furries that might otherwise have been overlooked simply because of the language barrier. So
if there are any Japanese speaking furries out there who are looking for some extra volunteer hours, you let us know.
So but to get back to your question, as far as we can tell, the stigma, we tend to find stigma in the fandom regardless of where you go. It tends to be much in the same thing as what you find here, whereas people assume it's either like a sexual deviancy of some sort, or they assume that it's some kind of mental illness of some sort. Again, from the Eastern European sample, a lot of the assumptions were that you're a corrupter of the youth, or that you're a zoophile, or that you're something damaged or wrong with you in the head. We from what we can tell, at least anecdotally speaking, and from the small amount of data we have, that tends to be true in other places. Getting into the nitty gritty of it is going to require a lot more study, and it's something we're looking to do in the next few years as we make contact with more and more furries around the world, and we continue to grow our network of contacts and resources on the ground. I don't know if Dr. Shazzy wants to add to that, or.
I just want to do a shout out to Blue Nadir for being from South Africa. That is where I was born, and so I'm just feeling really connected over the internet right now.
So I don't see any more questions. So I don't know if you want to give it a minute and see if folks have any more questions, or.
Nuka, what are you working on right now, publishing wise and data wise?
So publishing wise, I'm primarily working on editing the anime book, but we just finished the data collection and analysis from the survey. If you follow us on Furscience, you'll notice that we on our Twitter page or on our Facebook page, we put out a call in September. We put out a call in September for participants in a large scale summer study. We've collected all of that data over the summer, and I did sort of a preliminary analysis. So I've been looking at that data, trying to make sense of it, interpret it. So that's things like reading through hundreds of responses to this generation gap question, looking at furry spending habits. So I'm looking to try to consolidate all of that data into something manageable, because right now there's tens of thousands of individual pieces of data there. So we have to sort of condense it into something that's not just a big pile of numbers. Data on COVID. So a big part of the impetus for that study was the current COVID pandemic. Social scientists are nothing if not opportunistic. We never miss a chance to do a good study. And so we're studying COVID in the fandom. And I guess if you want sort of a sneak peek for what's coming next year, we do have some data suggesting, for example, that furries will turn to other furries for social support, but they'll turn to their families for social support, which is maybe it's just me. I think that's quite surprising. And interesting, and speaks to the depth of the connections furries form in this fandom. So that's one of the things I'm working on right now. I also have a student who is interested in sort of continuing on with this research, looking at coping as how furries cope within the fandom and their overall well-being, and strategies that furries use to cope, and comparing that to other fandoms. So one of my honor students is doing a project comparing furries to Star Wars fans. And the next month, we're going to be collecting the Star Wars fan data. And then hopefully at around November or December, we'll be collecting data from furries to sort of compare to the Star Wars fans. So we'll keep you in the loop there. How about yourself, Sharon? What are you up to in the next little bit?
Well, actually, I've been pretty interested in just going through some of the anime stuff, but specifically within that of relevance to this conversation are the furry anime conversation or comparisons. And, I was starting to dig into some of the data that we've got on transgender well-being in the two different fandoms. And I'm finding it really fascinating to see how these fandoms seem to have such protective factors for transgender folks. I think that's really, really interesting. So I'm actually just staring at a graph right now, and in the furry fandom, people who identify as trans are basically doing the same as in terms of self-esteem as women in the anime fandom. And so I find that really neat, because there aren't that many studies of transgender folks that are big, that have lots of numbers in them, but the ones that do exist are pretty, they're pretty heartbreaking to see, the kinds of outcomes as inevitably a result of stigma and discrimination and harm that others are doing to people who are transgender. So I'm pretty interested in this element of it, and that's something I'm looking forward to digging into a little bit more. So specifically that element of it. The question that was from Blue Nadir about, how fandoms are, how people are perceiving their own way of being seen internationally and differences between that. I think that's a great idea. I like that idea a lot. So I'm going to probably be taking some time to look through the data that we've got and see if there's any way to analyze and categorize that. Have to basically just see what the numbers look like from countries.
There was another really good question here that came up from Kit, Transmogrified, or Kit via Transmogrified. Do you think that virtual cons will go away when the pandemic ends, or do you predict that they will become a permanent part of the fandom?
Great question.
Love that question. And in fact, I'll sort of do a loop around here. This very same question is being asked right now of professors, because currently this semester I have to do all of my teaching online. So I'm used to teaching in front of a class of 100, 120 students. Because of the COVID crisis here in Canada, and in particular in Quebec, where I'm from right now, it's particularly nasty right now. They have us all. Yeah, we're having a race right now.
Yeah, right.
But we're all teaching online, and there's been a big question about what's going to happen. Like, do we ever get fully back to normal or not? And one of the things that's been nice about the experience, if anything nice can come from this, it's that it's allowed us to see opportunities that maybe we'd never considered before. In doing all of this online teaching, for example, I'm realizing that, hey, it's kind of nice to be able to supplement my in-class teaching with some of these online things, right? I would never have made the push to try recording myself in advance for my students if I'd not tried this before. And so it's changing the way we're thinking about teaching, and I imagine it's going to change the way we think about doing conventions as well. One of the things we've often noted is that there's this sort of fear of missing out that happens among a lot of furries, where all your friends are going to the convention, but darn, I can't make it this year, or I live just a little bit too far away to make it out to that convention. And so it's nice to be able to have something online like this, right? It's kind of helped us to realize that, hey, you can be from a different part of the country. You can be, if you can't make it financially this year, you can still be involved. And we've seen that at many major conventions. You've maintained the sense of community by allowing these online versions of the convention to go on. So I think even if we don't have fully online conventions necessarily once things get back to normal, I would be incredibly surprised if we didn't learn some lessons from what we're doing now and say, hey, why can't we have the masquerade from Anthicon be something that gets, I think in some cases too, I don't know if Anthicon does this, but I'm pretty sure some of these things get streamed online, or at very least they get recorded and posted online later. But for some of these bigger events, especially, I don't see why they couldn't be streamed and made more interactive. So certainly, I think a good convention will roll with this, use it as a learning opportunity, and integrate it into more conventions. I think it helps boost your numbers too, if nothing else. So. Well, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. I have seen a lot of the conventions doing their best to make their conventions more accessible by having an online presence. And that was going on for a couple of years before we got into COVID. I think that, now I'm just going to put on my sociologist hat here, and I really appreciated your structural functional analysis, Nuka, of what's going on in terms of the consequences and, solving some issues. But I think what's going to happen is that I think the financial state of the world and work opportunities have just been catapulted into change because of what's happening with COVID. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic about things. I'm a sociologist. What I forecast are probably some pretty significant work changes that are probably going to be permanent. And a lot of people are going to be affected by them. And it's going to take time to rejig that, whether it comes down to like a universal basic income or, whatever. We need to find some answers. But I think what that means is that there's going to be a greater disparity between those who have extra resources and those who don't. And if this fandom has taught me anything, it's about this desire to be inclusive and to be kind and generous. And I think that those kinds of economic conditions are going to be a reality for a lot of people in the world. And that I can foresee the fandom doing its best to try and sort of make up for some of that, the disparity between those who have the resources and those who don't, by being more inclusive in this way. So I do think that we will see a continuation and probably specifically more interactive as opposed to like just straight streaming. I think more interactive stuff will be happening as a result of this. I do think that we will see conventions again someday.
Yeah,
but I think
we can hope.
I think the accessibility issue has really come to a forefront with this, and I think it'll be something that gets solved.
And speaking to that, you just prompted a really neat idea in my mind. One of the things that I've been noticing as I go through the data is with each generation of younger furries, there's changes in the media that are the most sort of popular to them. I definitely felt this generation. So we're going to the generation gap stuff here. I definitely felt this generation gap where furries 10 years younger than myself say that the primary way they engage with the fandom is through YouTube, is through Twitch streams, which 10 years ago was kind of unheard of. It's like, what do you mean you have a favorite furry YouTuber? There are no furry YouTubers, and nowadays it's definitely a thing. So I think as younger furries tend to be, their involvement with the fandom is more and more online. You're going to see it being, I think it'll cater to that. Cons will want to cater more to that. And it'll also make these cons more accessible to younger furries, right? Mm-hmm. To the 15 or 16-year-old furry who, can't, they can't get permission from their parents to go to a furry convention in their states or across the country. It might help them sort of get their foot in the door in the fandom at a younger age. So I think that might be a really neat opportunity for the fandom to be able to bring younger folks into the community sooner, rather than saying, well, wait till you get to your first con or your first local meetup. At least it helps them be a little bit more involved sooner.
I was going to ask you, Nuka, I know that the questionnaire from the summer had COVID stuff on it. Anything striking coming out of that data, or haven't you had a chance to get to that part yet?
With respect to the age generation stuff yet?
Oh, just the COVID.
The COVID stuff.
Yeah, we had COVID questions on our last survey.
Yeah, we find that furries in general are doing pretty okay and coping pretty well with it all. All things considered. The kinds of concerns they have are the kinds of concerns you'd expect. So concerns about severe disruptions to their day-to-day life, but also their long-term plans. We tend to find concerns about their economic sort of viability. Things like, can you pay rent in the next month? Are you going to be able to pay off those student loans? These things were already pretty tumultuous for a fandom that's predominantly 18 to 25. Financial insecurity was already a problem. Yep. Because sort of in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, we never fully recovered from that.
Youth are the first to get fired, last to get rehired, hit the hardest by economic crashes all the time. Yeah.
So it was already a rough situation financially. So this is just gonna compound that more. But it's also interesting again that furries turned to the fandom for their social support. That was the one of the biggest sources of social support for them. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see a lot more. You see this among younger people in general too. There's more instances of younger people, instead of trying to get a house for themselves, hey, let's get a house for 3 or 4 of us, or hey, let's get a bunch of us to share an apartment together. A lot more of this, we're in this together, sharing resources and pooling our resources. And I think you'll see some of that as sort of a byproduct of this.
It's like sociologists could see this coming 25 years ago or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Archer Pupper mentions here, I'm not exactly a younger furry, but the furry Twitch community helped me not be a closeted fur. Yeah. So, when I say younger furries, I don't mean only 16 to 17-year-old furries. What I mean is compared to, say, the 30 and 40-year-old furries who've been around for 10 or 20 years, it's the 18 to 25-year-old furries who are much more, I think, in tune with, the YouTube scene, right? I can name on one hand the number of furry YouTubers I know. I don't think I've ever actually sat down and watched a full Twitch stream of anything before. So I'm dating myself and sound like an old fogey here, trying to talk about this stuff. But certainly in the fandom, it's a much more online fandom. And the fandoms always had kind of this online element, but it's a lot more dynamic. So the online portion of the fandom was often either chat rooms or forums or, websites like Fur Affinity and sharing art and comments on that. But more and more you're seeing this sort of live stream, Telegram kind of fandom or live stream fandom where there's interaction moment to moment with other furries and more sort of furry celebrities, I think, who aren't just artists, right? When we think of furry celebrities, we often think of artists, but more and more, YouTubers, right, and Twitch streamers are making up a bigger and bigger part of what you might call a popufur or a furry celebrity these days. So,
of all of that online interaction, we have to wrap things up. We want to thank our hosts for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
We also want to just send in a request to go to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, all at Furscience. And please follow us. It really helps us, like I said, with our funding and with our final reach. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, for taking some time out of your weekend to listen to us talk.
Absolutely. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And thank you for sticking around to answer questions, too.
Not a problem. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Happy to. All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye. The next stream that we have up is Art and Chill with several of our artists. We will get that set up in just a couple minutes and be running with that around 5:30.
Silver Gato Man, he bought me a coffee. Silver Gato Man, here is the song for thee. He likes to video all the panels at the cons. You should go and watch them whether they are short or long. Silver Gato Man, you video that's not a jibe. All of you go to his YouTube channel and like and subscribe.